Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. Happy birthday, Morningstar. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. So when PIMCO was starting to talk to Morningstar back last fall about participating in this conference, they had come to me and they said, they're interested in hearing about policy, and I'm like, what is there going to be to talk about? Hillary Clinton probably will be elected, and it will effectively be status quo. So what am I going to get up there and talk about? Well, how wrong were we? There's obviously a lot to talk about right now. I think as evidenced by the fact that the Dow, when I woke up this morning, Australia time, the Dow had sold off 350 points. In the United States, politics is really informing what markets are doing. So into today's session, I'll talk for about 30 minutes and then open up for Q&A. But in that period of time, I'll hope to try to really separate kind of the noise from the facts. What, as you, from a market's perspective, what should you be focusing on? What is most likely to happen? And what are potential market implications? And then, of course, I'll open up to questions. So I'll start out just sort of laying the atmosphere in Washington. What is sort of the policy-making environment right now? Albeit it's changing very quickly, apparently. Can't be on an airplane flight without Wi-Fi, because if I am, I land and I'm like, oh my God, rumors of impeachment and what have you. So it's a very dynamic environment, but we'll try to kind of set the stage and then again talk about what's likely to happen. I'm not going to relitigate what happened in November in the United States, but I think just a couple of key points here. Of course, President Trump won the Electoral College vote, which is determinative of the White House victory, but he lost the popular vote. He was the fifth person in U.S. history, president in U.S. history, to lose the popular vote. He lost the popular vote by about 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton. A lot of people ask, our international clients ask, so how did he win? He won by a few kind of reasons. One is that he was able to attract some holdovers, some independents from the Democratic Party, the independents who were not really convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to be the best person to lead. And then Hillary Clinton also was not able to manage to bring out the Obama coalition, so to speak. So while she got African Americans and the majority of the female vote, she wasn't able to replicate the Obama support. So, of course, ended up losing the White House. The real point, though, that I want to make here on the election outcome is Congress, because so much of what President Trump talked about on the campaign trail, so much of what he talked about that's relevant to markets in the US and internationally, tax reform, fiscal expansion in the form of increased spending, infrastructure, what have you, is predicated on the approval of Congress. So the composition of Congress really matters. By way of background, 2 chambers of Congress in the United States, the House of Representatives, 435 seats, which are up every 2 years for re-election. Republicans kept their really historically high majorities in the House. They have 241 votes versus Democrats that have 194. You only need 218 votes to pass legislation via the House in the United States. So long way of saying they have a pretty healthy majority to pass legislation in the House of Representatives. The Senate, though, is a really, to use an American expression, another ball of wax. The Senate, while Republicans do have a simple majority in the Senate, 52 to 48 Democratic votes, most legislation in the United States needs 60 votes to pass the Senate. So they only have 52 votes, they need 60. So by definition, for many things to pass the Senate, they'll actually need to get Democrats to get on board, which we'll talk about in a second, is maybe a little bit trickier than I think some people and maybe some of the markets expected. There is one way to pass legislation via 50 votes, by a simple majority in the Senate called reconciliation, which we'll get into in just a moment. But I think the punchline here is, yes, Republicans have majorities in both chambers of Congress, but the Senate, their majority is razor thin, only 52 to 48, and that could actually impede their ability to get things through Congress that, again, markets care about. So in terms of kind of President Trump and where he stands now, And this is obviously very dynamic, but his approval ratings have actually been holding pretty firm. They were about 40% when he went into office. This was from about 2 weeks ago at 41%. In light of the events over the last week or so, they're around 39%. But I think a really important point to make here is that his support among Republicans, among his own party, is actually standing pretty firm. So this says, in the yellow bar here, 87%, that's decreased to about 85%. That means 85% of Republicans in the United States still support President Trump. So what does that mean? Well, that means, again, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that means the chances of the Republican Party at this point turning against President Trump are not that high, just because of this fact that actually Republicans in the United States are still supporting Donald Trump. Now that could change, but as of now, that's sort of the state of affairs. The other point of this slide that I think is important is that Democrats, only 9% of Democrats support President Trump. So again, going back to my point about the 60 votes in the Senate means you need 8 Democrats to pass most legislation in the Senate. That's going to be really difficult to do when only 9% of Democrats in the United States actually support Donald Trump. And unfortunately, sort of the last point of this slide is how kind of partisan, the United States is right now. You have a president that has 9% approval rating among Democrats and 85% approval rating among his own country. So things, unfortunately, instead of President Trump really bringing things together, people together, the parties together, I would argue things are just even more partisan. This is sort of a busy slide, but I think a couple of important points on this. The first, the top table just shows what the composition of President Trump's cabinet is in terms of government experience. And this is a point that my husband actually trades equities. So right before President Trump was inaugurated, I was saying, the fact that he doesn't have government experience is kind of a big deal, and I feel like the market is missing it. And he's like, oh, God, you bears at PIMCO, you're always talking about nuance and what have you. He's like, that doesn't even matter. Markets don't care about government experience. But I would argue that you have the first president in the history of the Republic who doesn't have military experience and doesn't have government experience. And he's surrounded himself with folks who have been arguably very successful in their own right, but also don't have government experience. So only 50% of his cabinet, around 50% of his cabinet has had government experience before versus a much higher percentage of folks in other administrations, Republican and Democrat. And of course, he has a much bigger kind of business presence in terms of his cabinet, which again, I think arguably from a market's perspective, they like that initially. But I would argue that some of these missteps that we've seen, whether it was the rollout of the immigration ban in January, whether it was the disclosure of potentially classified information to Russia, is because he has not surrounded himself with folks who know Washington. I know that's sort of a pejorative thing, people who know Washington, but it actually, I would argue, really matters in terms of getting things through. The second table on the bottom just shows, and again, this is sort of this like weedy inside baseball thing, but I think it's important in terms of Trump being able to advance his agenda. He has been very slow to nominate and get his folks confirmed. And now, first-time administrations, Republican or Democrat, are usually slow. They have a pretty steep learning curve in terms of getting folks sort of nominated and put in place. But if you compare to certainly to President Obama's administration, but really to any of the other administrations, he has not been able to nominate as many people or get as many people confirmed. And the sort of the punchline here for that, from an investor's perspective, is that much of what he wants to do at the administrative level, the executive branch level, is predicated on getting his political people nominated and confirmed. And if he doesn't do that quickly, he is going to, again, have more obstacles in terms of getting his agenda through. Okay, so what does this all mean? I hope I haven't totally bored you to death. Hopefully everyone has another cup of coffee. So how we're thinking about it at PIMCO, really from the very beginning, right after the election, was sort of the fattening of tails, so to speak, where propeller heads at PIMCO, we think about everything and distributions and what have you. So if you look at the normal distribution curve, we thought that President Trump sort of elevated both of the tails. So certainly the right tail, or the chance for positive pro-growth policies were much higher under a Trump administration than, say, under a Clinton administration. So chances for tax reform, fiscal expansion, deregulation, for sure. And that is what the US equity market has predominantly been focused on, this right tail. But again, as sort of a bond house and naturally skeptical, we felt like the market was not focused on the left tail. The potential for missteps, whether it was protectionism, which has decreased a little bit, we'll talk about this in just a moment, the chance for a geopolitical misstep, and honestly, just a chance for a misstep from a policy perspective because of this lack of government experience. And I think that this characterization that we had thought of really back in November has actually held true, sort of the fattening of the tails. I think right now we would say that the right tail is probably more clipped than the left tail. So what does that actually mean? And there's a lot on this slide, so I'll try to just give you kind of the punchlines here. And honestly, some of these probabilities for things getting passed have changed over the last week, and I was not able to update my slides quickly enough. But in terms of what will likely happen over the next 12 months, I think healthcare kind of has to happen, honestly. Healthcare is probably one of the most difficult policy issues on the Hill. I worked on the Hill for several years, and everybody knew, Democratic, Republican, knew that trying to tackle healthcare was really difficult. Republicans also haven't really had unanimity among their caucus about what they want to do with healthcare. But the reason why we think that something will likely get done at some point is because it was their #1 campaign promise. Both Donald Trump and congressional Republicans said that they would repeal Obamacare and replace it with something. I think that the market has underestimated how complex healthcare policymaking is and how long it will take. To give you some context, Obamacare took 14 months, from start to finish. So this idea that they were going to be able to get healthcare out in like 2 months, it just seemed really aspirational, honestly. But I do think you'll probably see something get done on healthcare over the next 12 months. But that takes us down to things like tax reform and infrastructure. Tax reform, we have a 60% odds on the paper. I think it's more of like a coin flip at this point. I think that unlike healthcare, there is actually agreement among the Republicans that they want to get something done on taxes. But tax reform versus tax cuts in the United States is much more difficult because tax reform entails winners and losers. You take any of those deductions out of the tax code in the US, that means that there are whole special interest groups that are going to be lobbying on the Hill to try to protect them. And that just means that the process of actually tax reform gets more complicated. I think if you see anything on taxes in the United States, it will probably be smaller and will take longer. I think it is very unlikely that you see a tax bill signed on the president's desk by end of 2017. I think something much more realistic is the beginning of 2018. But however, and a big however, if it takes much longer than the beginning of 2018, that's an election year for the House and the Senate. And honestly, members of Congress are just really not interested in taking difficult votes during an election year. So the longer that tax reform takes to even get a tax bill, to get agreement between the administration and Congress about whether they want tax reform or tax cuts, the higher chances that the probability of tax reform goes down. So again, we have that at a coin flip right now. And then other things, infrastructure spending. This is like, everyone likes to talk about infrastructure spending outside of the Hill. On the Hill, nobody's talking about infrastructure spending. I don't think that Republicans really support big deficit spending, fiscal expansion from a government spending perspective. And I don't think Democrats at this point have any political incentive to actually work with President Trump, again, because of that 9% approval rating. So the bottom line in infrastructure, again, we have 50%. I think it's probably a little bit lower at this point. And then on regulation, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I think the bottom line on regulation from a legislative perspective, like Dodd-Frank rollback, that's very unlikely, but you could see some regulatory relief at the executive level. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then, insofar as the sort of left tail event, so that's kind of the right tail. So that's not a really great positive picture for the right tail, honestly. You might see something on healthcare, maybe something on taxes, but it's probably smaller, takes longer. Infrastructure spending probably remains elusive, and then Dodd-Frank rollback is kind of a non-starter. So the right tail is probably a little bit more clipped than I think the equity market has priced in. But the left tail, I would argue, is probably a little bit more clipped as well versus what we expected right after the election. And the reason for that is that, I think that you've seen with President Trump, especially on trade, that he's actually realizing that these trade agreements like NAFTA actually benefit many of the folks who voted for him, especially in the Midwestern states. So will you see a renegotiation of NAFTA? Probably. Will you see the United States withdrawing from NAFTA? Probably not. And again, from a market's perspective, that's probably good news that you're going to see less draconian action on trade. And then immigration, which you all probably don't care very much about, but from a social perspective, we care about in the United States. So from the market's perspective, I don't think markets care, I should say. But I think from a social perspective, folks care. I think immigration, again, you probably will see some actions on immigration, but not as draconian as some of the things that he had sort of started out with. So I think the bottom line here is that while the market, the equity market especially, had priced in a really fat right tail, that I think their expectations are coming down to earth about what is likely to happen. But at the same time, those left tail, the chances for big protectionist policies like a trade war with China are also have also probably decreased. This is our sort of base case on tax reform, which I'm not going to necessarily spend very much time on. Just regulation. This is an important point because a lot of people in financial services like to think that there's going to be some deregulatory bonanza in Washington. And that is true to a certain extent. So things like the DOL fiduciary rule, which were mentioned earlier, that is likely not going to come to pass. So that is certainly a positive. But in terms of bank capital rules being rolled back, that could happen at the executive level without Congress, but it will take a while. And why do I say that? Well, because of the fact that President Trump has been slow to nominate his folks and get people into these various agencies, right now, at about half of the agencies with jurisdiction over financial services issues, they're led by Obama people. So here you have, like the Fed, like with Janet Yellen, or the FDIC or the CFPB, all with sort of broad jurisdiction over banking regulation or enforcement issues led by Obama folks. And so that's going to be at odds in terms of pushing forward President Trump's regulatory agenda. So kind of the bottom line here is we will probably see some softening of regulation, think the interpretation of Basel rules, think like some financial services regulation, but it will probably be more incremental and will take longer than certain sectors like financial services in terms of equities have probably priced in. The Fed, obviously, as bond geeks, we're very focused on what is the Fed going to look like under Donald Trump. Just as a reminder, the Fed Board of Governors, 7 seats. Right now, there are 3 vacancies, 2 holdover vacancies from the Obama administration. I'm sure he wished he had gotten his people in at that point, but he decided not to for whatever reason. And then the resignation of Dan Tarullo, who oversaw some of the banking regulation for the Fed. And then the big question, so that's 3 vacancies. Then the big question, of course, is Janet Yellen, when her term as chair is up in February of next year, and Stanley Fischer, when his term is up as vice chair in the middle of 2018. I think there's a lot of questions about whether President Trump would renominate Janet Yellen. Within PIMCO, there's been a lot of active dialogue about that as well. My hunch is probably not. Even though there is certainly precedent of presidents renominating Fed chairs, like Obama did with Bernanke, I think it is unlikely that he keeps Janet Yellen in for the simple reasons I think he'll get a lot of political blowback from Senate Republicans. I think the question is, if he doesn't renominate Janet Yellen, who will he nominate? There's been some speculation that he'll nominate somebody who's more hawkish. I also think that's unlikely. And the reason is it's very much contrary to his pro-growth economic agenda. So somebody like a John Taylor or even a Kevin Warsh, who's arguably more hawkish, I think is probably less likely than somebody like Gary Cohn, who's the head of his National Economic Council, who's a more markets person and who's likely to be more dovish and more sort of markets sympathetic. So kind of bottom line here is there's a lot of questions about what the Fed will look like over the next 12 months. Again, he'll have the chance of nominating probably 5 out of the 7 board governors. And we just don't exactly know what President Trump's approach on monetary policy is going to be. But my inclination is it's probably going to be more dovish than what he at least said on the campaign trail when he sort of equivocated about monetary policy. This is about the equity markets. This is obviously a little bit different now after yesterday, but it just shows you sort of in historical context how the equity market, at least, has reacted to various presidencies and congressional control. You'll see that the market has actually done quite well when there's been a Republican Congress, when there's been a Republican one-party Congress, and it's pretty consistent with the market performance under President Trump. I think the big question for the equity markets, and again, we're fixed income people, but the big question for the equity markets is if this pro-growth stuff doesn't come to pass, if you don't see tax reform, if you don't see infrastructure, if you don't see major regulatory rollback in 2017, does that support the valuations that we've sort of seen in the equity market over the past 4 months or so? In terms of how we're positioned, again, we're fixed income folks. We have had a little bit more of a long bias in terms of U.S. duration. We've taken that down a little bit as rates have rallied. So we're basically neutral to U.S. duration. We're actually underweight the front of the curve. We're overweight the belly of the curve. And I think we, at this point, given all of the risks in the marketplace, we would be very loath to be underweight U.S. duration. Now, if yields come down much, much more, that might change, and we might be able to take some tactical advantage. But just as sort of a matter of policy, I think we're going to be either neutral or a little bit long, just given the political uncertainty. Sort of in that same vein, we've been harvesting gains in credit, taking advantage of the various valuations. Also because our outlook is that President Trump will probably be less protectionist than what folks had expected. We're actually taking advantage of some of the FX valuations in emerging markets. And then I think the last point here is that there's just going to be more volatility in the market. There's going to be more volatility from a policy perspective. Certainly if the Russia and the Comey and the Michael Flynn investigation gains traction, there will be more volatility. And so as you would probably predict from an active manager, we would make a pitch for active management here, because we actually think this is sort of the environment where active managers can shine. We can take opportunities and inefficiencies in the market to create alpha for our clients. And then I'll just end with just in terms of what you all should look for if you're trying to read the newspaper in terms of the next couple of weeks, the next few months. Clearly, how does this whole Comey-Flynn investigation proceed? That's sort of self-evident. Does healthcare actually gain traction in the Senate, or does it just stall there? And then who's leading on tax reform? I think this is a big unknown question still. Is it the administration? Is it Congress? Is there a plan on infrastructure? As of now, we haven't seen one. Does that actually materialize? If it does, then the chances of infrastructure probably go up a little bit. Although, again, I don't think you're going to have a lot of Democratic support for infrastructure. And then other things from a staffing perspective. I think this is a big unknown. There are rumors this morning that President Trump is going to fire his entire West Wing. So if he does do that, obviously that's just more volatility, more uncertainty. And then do geopolitical tensions increase? What is our approach towards North Korea? I will open it up to Q&A now, but thank you so much. I hope, again, I haven't bored everyone to tears, and happen to open it up to Q&A.
So as I referenced at the start, you are able to submit questions through the app. So if you're looking for where to do that, if you click through the agenda icon within the app and then select the first keynote session, you can able to submit some questions that way. But we do also have some mics roving around the floor. So if there are any questions on the floor, please stick your hand up and your microphone will find its way to you. While we're doing that, I might just kick off. Libby, so given the sort of rather seemingly haphazard speed with which Trump is affecting change and changing his mind and making changes to the staff and whatnot, when you're interacting with sort of the investment committee and whatnot, how difficult is it to try and take any sort of medium to long-term views around some of this stuff, given the speed of the change?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that, I view my job as trying to sort of discern kind of the noise from the reality. And in terms of what the markets care about, they care about these big fiscal things, right? And so I think if you kind of contextualize and look at those items as it relates to how Trump will be able to advance his agenda through Congress, I think that's always a good kind of question. Does this help him get, say, tax reform done, or does this not help him? So certainly a staff shakeup, a select committee investigating his connections with Russia do not help him. So I think we kind of look at the things through that lens.
Cool. So first question from the floor. What new opportunities does Trump offer Australia, do you think?
What new opportunities does Trump? Well, obviously, his first course of action was to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course, of which Australia was included. He has said from a trade perspective that he's much more inclined to proceed with bilateral negotiations, bilateral trade agreements versus multilateral trade agreements. We'll kind of see if that actually comes to fruition. He hasn't really done that quite yet, but I think that would be an area of opportunity in terms of a bilateral negotiation with Australia.
Okay. So what's the probability of Trump completing a full term? What's the view on Pence's policies?
No comment. The reason I say that is it's very difficult right now to know any of this. Again, going back to that question about what I'm telling the investment committee, I just sort of think how does this impact his ability to actually get things done in Washington, regardless if he's impeached or if he resigns, at least in the short term, this is going to be yet another headwind for him advancing his agenda through Congress, tax reform, infrastructure, what have you. So, it just is, it's noise, it's distraction, and it just means that, again, some of this optimism about what he might bring should be, I think, sort of tempered a little bit more. Is that like a non-answer to that question? In terms of Pence's policy, Pence, honestly, and this is sort of the irony, is that the market actually might really like a Pence presidency because he is a traditional Republican. He is socially conservative, but fiscally conservative. He wants to have less spending, fewer taxes, less regulation, and he's a more sort of consistent conservative along those lines, or a more traditional conservative than certainly President Trump. I think the big kind of qualifier there is that if Trump has to resign, then does sort of the bully pulpit of that whole administration and anybody who was associated with him also decrease. And I think that's a known.
Okay, so you spend plenty of time in Washington. The next question is, what is the role of lobbyists today, and how has that changed?
Has their influence been diminished under Trump? That's a great question. I'd like to say that it has been diminished. I don't know if it really has been. I will say that this administration is much more open to kind of meetings and to taking meetings, especially from business participants. So insofar as we've interacted and engaged with the administration for priorities that are relevant to our clients, it's actually been much more kind of easy and accessible. I think, I don't know, I'm probably a little bit biased. I think that the sort of narrative about how much lobbyists and special interests really run Washington is a little bit overstated. I mean, members of Congress are politically expedient creatures, and that means that they actually have to get votes at the end of the day. So they are very unlikely to take votes that are going to hamper their ability to get reelected. So meaning that even if a lobbyist comes and is lobbying for a view that is sort of contrary to their populace who has to reelect them, they're not going to be likely to take them. So I don't know, I think that sort of narrative is a little bit overstated in Washington in general.
Cool. What are the chances of tax cuts without reform?
Yeah, so yeah, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear on this. I think that's kind of our base case, is that if you get something on tax, it's probably going to be smaller and probably more emphasis on tax cuts and much less on reform. I think that you might see like repatriation be included because that's a revenue raiser. That's the provision that would allow U.S. companies to bring back kind of trap cash at a discount rate. But I think that, you know, overall, the easiest thing to get done on Capitol Hill are tax cuts. So I think, if anything gets done on tax cuts, which, again, sort of a coin flip at this point, it probably would be more emphasis on cuts than on reform.
So there's a question on a related theme that's quite specific here. Is US tax reform in potentially removing 401k benefit seems to be gaining traction? How does that impact overall market valuations if we start seeing American cash flows retrace?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about sort of the Rothification, the Roth IRA issue being modified. You know, and now, again, I just said the lobbyists don't have a lot of influence. The financial services are very much lobbying against this. So, you know, I think this is an area that is going to be hard for them, for policymakers to change. It does raise a lot of money for other parts of tax reform, so I think it's attractive from that perspective. But honestly, if you look at sort of the macro picture, people want people to be, you know, investing in retirement and savings in the U.S., and taking away these tax benefits is sort of contrary to that objective. So I think you might see headlines about it. I think it's quite unlikely that you actually see that in an ultimate bill.
Okay. There's a question on the floor down there.
How credible is the report that the firing of Preet Bharara and Comey were based on weekly briefing from KGB?
I don't think, I'd say no comment on that because I don't know. I think that's pretty unlikely. But, you know, I think that what we're seeing if you just sort of take a step back, is a president that is used to running a company and not a country. And that sort of sounds like, you know, sort of a trite thing to say. But, you know, obviously in the United States, there are checks and balances. It's not an autocracy. You can't just do things because you want to do them. And so I think that some of the pushback that you're getting around sort of the Comey firing and other terminations is sort of an indication that, you know, the people who work for these institutions, you know, namely Congress, are actually trying to sort of remind President Trump that he can't just do whatever he wants to do, sort of with impunity.
Another one on the floor at the back.
Obviously, the Fed aren't taking too much notice of the Trump noise. What's the PIMCO view on where do you think the Fed is in terms of its program of rate rises? Are they ahead of the curve? Are they behind the curve? And given the fact that Yellen's got a time limit on her till February next year, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, our base case has been pretty similar to consensus, although I think we have, at this point, we think that a June hike is probably more likely than what the market expects. Partly that's because of the unemployment print, the 4.4%. You're actually seeing some signs of wage inflation. And you have a Fed that we know wants to get off the zero bound as much as possible in order to be able to start contracting their balance sheet. And we believe that that is a priority for a Yellen Fed. So our expectation is, you know, is sort of 3 hikes for total for 2017. But I think the bigger question is sort of the trajectory of the rate hikes. And it's been our long-held view, at least for the last 3 years, that, you know, the sort of a lower neutral rate. So that the Fed funds rate will likely be lower for longer, and that pretty much stays intact. But at least for 2017, we do think that as long as the market allows the Fed to go, we think that they'll probably take the opportunity because they do want to get off the zero bound in order to start decreasing, or at least thinking about decreasing their balance sheet.
Another question. Policy-related and geopolitical risks appear abundant, yet the VIX is at all-time lows.
Yeah.
Is the market completely mispricing this?
Yeah. So I'm not a vol trader, nor do I pretend to be one, but I will say my own personal view, it's a little bit befuddling, just given how much uncertainty there is in the marketplace, especially, of course, as it relates to U.S. domestic politics. So our portfolio managers have more to say on that, but I think from my personal perspective, it does seem surprising that given just how much uncertainty there is around the world, but especially in the United States, that the VIX continues to be pretty sanguine about it.
Yeah. Back to Trump. Is he being treated unfairly by mainstream media?
Wow, so you would not get a laugh in the United States. That would be like, yeah, look, I think that you can say a lot about the media in the United States. I'm sure that there are, examples of bias on both sides, liberal media, also more conservative media. I think that the media, and I was definitely in this camp in terms of thinking that Hillary Clinton was going to win, was very surprised that President Trump won. Mm-hmm. So I think that has sort of set up an interesting dynamic between the media and President Trump. But I think you could probably see bias everywhere, again, on both sides of the aisle. So probably on average, I think it's as fair as I think you can expect given the circumstances.
Okay. How worried should we be about Trump's relationship with North Korea?
I think that we, in our left tail, our diagram about the normal distribution curve, certainly geopolitics is always a risk in any administration. I do think a geopolitical test with an administration that is not staffed with folks who do have a lot of government experience means that sort of the chances for a misstep are higher. However, his national security team and his defense team are really strong. Mattis at defense, McMaster in terms of the National Security Council. These are folks who are kind of top notch and have a lot of military experience. And I think you've sort of seen the effects of that. Sort of his national security response has been one of those areas that I think has justifiably gotten a lot of credit in terms of being, maybe more deliberate and more thoughtful and with fewer leaks and with less chaos. So I think North Korea is certainly a risk. It's certainly a risk to the markets. The interesting dynamic about North Korea is that it actually has meant that the United States has less incentive to start a trade war with China. So in some ways, that's actually probably been a good thing from an investor's perspective, from a market's perspective, that we've really seen sort of the China relationship as really important from a geopolitical perspective as it relates to North Korea. But there's certainly a lot of question marks around North Korea and what the future of that relationship is. Yeah,
okay. Now there's heaps of questions. We're going to do one last one to finish up. To date, Trump hasn't shown much diplomacy when it comes to dealing with foreign leaders. As his first official overseas trip approaches, what should we expect from him when it comes to managing U.S.'s relationships?
He had a sort of a rough start with your leader, didn't he? I think he's learning. I think you just take a step back and you look at first-time administrations just in general. Again, there's just a really, the learning curve is really steep. I think it's been to his detriment that he hasn't had folks who have been more experienced. So I think we should expect this to sort of smooth out. I think Tillerson is also understanding the importance of these trips, his Secretary of State. We do know, or at least what the media has reported, so take it with a grain of salt, that President Trump is not really excited about going on this trip. So we'll see how it plays out. But I do think his reinforcement of the NATO relationship was really important from a foreign policy perspective, and I'm sure that's reassured many of the United States allies.
Yeah, cool. Okay, we could go on, but unfortunately we have to call time there. Libby, that's been fantastic. Thanks for sharing your insights today. So please join me in thanking Libby.
Thank you. Thanks for the great question.
Thanks, Libby.